Thank you very much, Yolanta. I'm pleased to be here. So it's August the 9th already. I hope everyone has been enjoying their summer. Let me talk to you for a moment about the approach we're taking to this series. We're basing our information and our approach on adult learning principles, such as we learn by doing. We've designed the seminar series to connect to the Orgwise standards. We will focus on a manageable number of key messages, trying to keep it simple and allowing you some time for reflection. This webinar is 90 minutes long in total, including questions and any interaction throughout. Rather than wait for questions at the end, we will try to get to them as we go along. So please feel free to type in questions in the chat area on your screen. This time, we'll aim to finish the presentations and questions on the core material by about 11:30, and we'll spend the last half hour looking at some websites, looking at a funding audit in more detail, and answering additional questions. This will accommodate your schedule and may help us to address the different levels of experience in the group. You're encouraged to use the chat function throughout if you feel like reacting to the material. We will be able to make time to pause and comment on the chats. You can also chat amongst yourselves, though I can't promise to pay attention to all of that while I'm speaking at the same time. The material is designed to be introductory and may not seem new to some people. Please do feel free, however, to ask questions about more advanced issues that are of concern to you, and we will be referring to some other material as we go along, including several slides of references that are suitable for different levels of experience with this subject. So sustainability planning is the topic for today. Before we get to it, let me just take a moment to introduce myself. As Yolanta mentioned, my name is Doreen Weston, and my company name is Full Circle Consulting, Inc. I have frontline experience mostly in employment services and ESL. My love has always been the nonprofit sector. Full Circle Consulting has been in existence for almost 15 years, and I've worked exclusively for the nonprofit organizations and the public sector. Contracts have included training and resource development, board development, organizational issues, and program evaluations, as well as a lot of writing helping organizations with their funding proposals and grant applications, etc. Over the last several years, clients have included settlement agencies, employment services for newcomers, and umbrella organizations related to settlement and employment. I'll just get the nod from Petra if she's ready to launch the first poll. And she is. So as I finish telling you the last little bit about myself, she's going to launch a poll, just a quick one to let me know whether or not you were on the first webinar. So that is launched. Just in case you're interested, I'll also tell you that my educational background includes a Bachelor of Arts, an MBA, and a certificate in nonprofit board governance. And because I love school, I'm currently working towards a certificate in project management. I'd like to thank Kathy Lang. She was with me last time, and you will hear much more from her again as she will do the sessions on social enterprise. Kathy Lang of C. Lang Consulting for her support and for sharing of her materials. So far we see that 55% of you were not on the first webinar and 41% of you said yes you were. So great, welcome back. For all of you, I would just like to repeat the key messages from the first webinar. which was an introduction to sustainability and revenue diversification. Sources of funding are only one aspect of diversity within an organization. You must have evidence of the need you would like to continue addressing in your sustainability plan. And funding diversification must be driven by a focus on the mission of your organization. So we'll certainly keep those in mind and build on them as we move through the series. Today's agenda is to look at developing an income diversification plan and sustainability plan. We'll talk a little bit about the differences between the two. We'll look at how to conduct a funding audit. We'll look at doing a funding environmental scan from the perspective of a settlement organization. And finally, we will look at staff and board development as it relates to funding diversification. Though we will touch on a few elements related to financial management, I'd like to be clear that this is not the focus. We're not here to repeat the good work that's already been done with the advanced financial management training offered through OCASI, and I'll refer you to the webinar on the Orgwise website. These are the learning objectives for today. You can see they're very closely related to the agenda, so I won't repeat them all. It will help us to know help me to know your organization's annual revenue from all sources. So I'll ask Petra to launch the second poll now, which you will recognize if you were with us on the first one. It's still helpful to ask you this question again. So you will be given a choice of your organization's annual revenue from all sources. If you don't know, just don't answer. We didn't have enough spaces to allow don't know as an option. So it's launching. Revenue sources include government grants, foundation grants, revenue from sales of goods and services, such as translation, interest income, etc. So over half of you have voted already. We'll just give you a second. Almost all in. We can see the mix is a little bit different from last time. So we have 5% of you under 100,000, 14% from 100 to 500,000, equal amount from 500,000 to $1 million, 45% from $1 million to $4 million, and 23% over $5 million in annual revenue. So when it comes to do the funding audit, you'll see that some of you are going to have a lot more homework than others, but I expect you'll be able to get some help with that. Sustainability is a broad concept and is about more than diversifying your sources of income. We'll review this equation from the TCC group, which states leadership plus adaptability plus program capacity equals sustainability. Strong leaders inspire and motivate others. They ensure staff understand the consequences of not succeeding. Sustainable leadership means letting go of consistently poor performers, whether paid or volunteer, and making decisions that stakeholders agree are cost-effective. So, for example, measuring the cost per child who improves his or her study behaviors rather than measuring the number of children served. This focus on cost-effectiveness enables leaders to make decisions grounded in the organization's mission and vision. Financial adaptability is about long-term relationships with stakeholders, effective financial management practices, and being informed about trends. Program adaptability includes the capacity to conduct program evaluation. Effective program management includes a high level of quality control and focus on continuous quality improvement. It distinguishes between best practices, necessary practices, and unnecessary ones. Marilyn Struthers states that goals with respect to sustainability may vary according to what's happening in the external environment, and that adaptability is important. In a rapidly changing economic environment, she says, the goal may not be to achieve stability, but to build up the fluidity to change organizational shape, build alliances, and take up the opportunities of the moment. Today we'll focus in on some approaches to build up both sustainability and fluidity. Let's be clear, we're talking about the same things. A sustainability plan is a plan that outlines how the organization will generate resources to meet the needs of the present without compromising the future, and how it will develop, mature, and cycle out programs to be responsive to constituencies over time. So we can see that this plan assumes that once you have a program, you're not going to have that program forever, that that program has a life cycle of its own. Income diversification plan, on the other hand, is a plan that outlines how the organization will generate resources from a wider range of sources as appropriate. So sustainability plan is broader reaching, and income diversification is part of it. If you do an internet search for sustainability plan, the majority of the websites you find will in fact address an income diversification plan. So they may not have that different definition for a sustainability plan, but our approach is still to make a distinction between the two. Both a sustainability plan and an income diversification plan are linked to your organization's strategic plan and priorities. Today I'll introduce a few aspects you may want to consider in a sustainability plan, but we'll spend the bulk of our time on Income Diversification Act. Some of you may have conducted feasibility studies. If you have, you may have looked into these three main areas: organizational, technical, and financial issues. You may recall that in the first webinar we stressed the important connection between sustainability and strategic planning. Let's look at these 3 points in a little bit more detail. In this instance, organizational issues is a broad category that may include the following elements you would consider if you were doing an assessment of your internal strengths and weaknesses: mission, services, organizational structure, human resources, policies and procedures, leadership, evaluation, governance, decision-making, etc. You would be able to add things to that list, I'm sure. Technical issues would also be part of your organizational assessment and could include the technology itself and how you use it. Hardware, software, social media, cloud computing, other systems that may involve technology. We'll look at financial issues in more detail shortly. If you were to look at these elements from a sustainability lens, you would be asking yourself, your staff, and your board the following questions. What is core to our organization? What is our niche? What do we truly believe needs to be sustained, and why? Answering these questions and supporting each answer with concrete evidence is hard work, but well worth it. Remember, in order to be sustainable, you must have evidence supporting the need you would like to continue addressing. We'll now look at assessing financial viability and impact, and we'll use a tool called the matrix map from a recent book called Nonprofit Sustainability: Making Strategic Decisions for Financial Viability. Income diversification, sometimes called funding diversification, is an important component of broader sustainability and strategic planning. If you know what is core to your organization and what you believe needs to be sustained, either a program or the whole organization, you will then need to identify sources of funding that will enable you to keep these elements running for as long as you need. This may mean diversifying sources of funding, including considering a social enterprise. Funding diversification fits into strategic planning in a couple of different ways. It may be a strategic priority in itself, or it may be a natural consequence of ensuring that a strategic priority can be accomplished. As we mentioned in the first webinar, an organization may no longer be able to subsidize activities that do not cover their own costs. The fact that an activity is necessary and even core to the mission does not necessarily mean that the organization can afford to keep it in its business model. The next slide will provide us with a way of making this assessment. Here you have the matrix map, and we'll go through what the quadrants mean. In order to be sustainable, an organization's programs must be financially viable, and they must also have an impact. Every activity directly affects impact and financial profitability, and so do decisions the organization makes. So this map helps you to link activities to your strategic imperatives. It can be used as a guide for strategic planning, as a decision-making tool, and to assess new possibilities. Once again, it's a time for you to reflect and do some analysis. So looking at the quadrants, in the bottom left, we'll start with the stop sign. Low impact and low profit. Now profit we don't mean in the corporate sense, but we mean at the very least it covers its own costs. Under this category, you would list programs which produce little or no revenue and do not have an impact on your mission. Unless you can revamp them so they can increase their impact on the mission or generate more revenue, they will be the first to be cut as they are of low value to your organization. Moving over to the right, that's a money tree. In this category, you would list programs that generate a lot of revenue but do not have a significant impact on your mission. These are your money trees. Special events or donors fit here. Look for ways to bring your mission message to these events. So always, always promote your mission. Kitty corner from there, in the hearts, are programs that have a high impact on your mission but generate little or no income. These are your hearts, the heart and soul of your organization. They often have a very valuable place but are sustained by revenue from other programs. If possible, strategize new ways to generate revenue for these programs. Moving over to the right then are our stars, the most important quadrant in the matrix. These programs have high impact and generate revenue for the organization. When planning for growth, you will want to look first at these programs and investigate opportunities for expansion. In a few moments, I'm going to ask you to do an assessment of your organization with respect to this matrix. In the meantime, I'm going to continue. Okay. Yes. Let's keep the flow going. So Petra, if you could launch the third poll now, that would be great. So knowing what you know about the matrix that we just reviewed, you're going to be asked what you think the majority of your programs are. Are they stop signs? Are they money trees? Are they hearts? Or are they stars? So take a moment to think about it. And when a few more of you have given us your opinion, I'll tell you one other thing you can do with that information. So far we have a lot of hearts. While the rest of you are casting your vote there, for those of you who are more visual and more mathematical, you can plot your programs on this matrix to get a picture of where you are. So you would draw just a regular graph with dollars across the x-axis and a measure of impact along the y-axis, and then you can put the dots for where your programs lie. If you want to make it a little more visual for yourself, the larger programs get bigger circles and the smaller programs get smaller circles. And then at a glance, you can see what the majority of your programs are. So it seems that 5% of you, off the top of your head, say that you have most of your programs are stop signs. 65% of you say hearts. 30% of you say stars. But nobody says money trees. So this is what we should do. I'll make a note to myself. We should bring this back now at the end of October, or maybe even beyond into the new year. You come back and you look at this again and you say, okay, after this webinar series, after our next round of strategic planning, do we even have one or two money trees growing in our organization? Great, thank you very much. So income diversification plan. It's important. This is a high-level overview of what to consider putting in an income diversification plan. It goes hand in hand with good financial management practices and with strategic planning. The funding audit is a part of the current financial situation analysis. So that's the first bullet. We'll give you a clear picture of this in a little bit. Look at impact and make decisions about the programs. You can use that matrix map we just looked at to know whether you need to continue funding them. Income diversification carries some risks. Evidence shows that more revenue streams don't necessarily mean greater annual surpluses or organizational scale. To attract and maintain new revenue streams, an organization has to develop and sustain new capacities. For example, the sources of your funding may mean different skills and different management, so corporate support is secured and managed differently than government grants. They're equally important, but they're not the same. There are also costs to have several sources of income. Each source comes with its own financial management and reporting requirements, and as we all know, this takes time. A financial sustainability plan is about money, but will also include other types of resources you might obtain, such as in-kind support, volunteer support, or shared resources from other organizations. It may even include convincing another organization to take on a project you have started. So in a sec, I'm going to switch over and show you a link that you think might be useful. So this will be my first time. Make sure I do this right. Oh, sorry, before then, there is a question. Can you cover again what high profit means for a not-for-profit? And give an example of high profit types of activities for a settlement and immigration agency. A high profit would mean, for example, obviously profit is not profit as in additional surplus dollars that go into the pockets of your boards of directors. Read it as being surplus. So if you have a government grant which is line item by line item, you're not going to usually have much of a surplus. Though if you look closely more at advanced financial management, there are some tips there. So high profit, the higher the profit means the higher the surplus. This may take you over to programs where you, for example, charge a user fee, where you have social enterprise and it's run as a program. For example, maybe you have clients working in a cafe as a job training program, but at the same time you want that cafe to turn a profit in the sense that it generates more revenue than expenses, and then that additional revenue then you can reallocate to different departments within your organization. So I hope that's useful. Thanks, Petra, for showing me that question. So let me make sure I can do this properly, and in a sec we should be able to see one of the links. I'm just going to mute for a second. Okay, so just about there. Strengthening. Yeah, I did it. Okay, here we go. And now I put my screen back on, and here we are. Yay. Except that's not the one I want. Huh. One moment. No, it's not the first one. Strengthening nonprofits. This is it. Sorry. Now I'll be an expert next time. This is from a website called strengtheningnonprofits.org, and it gives detailed steps in how to create a sustainability plan. So I'm not going to go through the whole thing in detail with you, but I would like to just point out a few categories. Talks about getting started with your sustainability plan. They provide you with some tools for you to use, like sustainability planning questions. Now, there is one thing, though, that I have to say I don't 100% agree with. I'll come to that in a sec. So it talks about building your case for support, identifying, defining the issues, explaining your purpose, etc. It also talks about developing strategies for establishing partnerships, and that in fact is going to be the main topic for our next webinar, is the collaboration and partnerships. So the one bit that I don't necessarily agree with entirely is where they say one way to become more sustainable is to replace your staff with volunteers. I think that begs a little more thought. We value our staff very much in our organization. We also value our volunteers. But I think that we really need to think again before we blithely go ahead and say, well, let's just replace staff with volunteers. That said, I think it's a very valuable resource. Thanks. So now we're back to our slides. Good, thank you. What have I done? I've paused it again by mistake. There we go. All set. Now we're moving on into conducting a funding audit. Let's define some terms again. Okay, 1 second. What happened? Oh, now I'm doing it. Okay, goodness me. I'll get better at this. Conducting a funding audit. There are some other terms that we should make clear, and one is that there's an audit of financial statements, and that's the verification of the financial statements of a legal entity done by practicing accountants, and that's something that is already familiar to you. A funding audit is the identification and analysis of funding sources at a given moment and over time. A fundraising audit is a detailed review of any factors that are likely to have a negative effect upon your organization's ability to raise funds. And a resource audit, we mentioned last time, is the identification and analysis of all resources, including personnel, physical assets, intangible assets, technology, and money. So today we'll focus in more detail on a funding audit, and we'll provide a blank template for you to complete as homework. But we'll also give you a few more pointers about a fundraising audit. So it's time for another poll. And this one is about how many different sources of revenue your organization has. And this time you have choices, the choice that says don't know. So your choices are 1 to 4 sources of revenue, 5 to 9, and over 10. And creative in your thinking. There's certainly no right or wrong answer to this question. So over half of you have let us know. We'll give you a little bit longer. Your answer will really depend on your mandate, the type of programs you offer, your size. As some research has shown, the number of funding sources may also relate to your organizational life cycle, with some organizations having few sources of revenue in the beginning, several sources of revenue in the middle, we'll say, and a few again at the end. So we can see that 12% of you don't know, 36% of you say you have between 1 and 4 sources of revenue, 44% of you say that you have between 5 and 9 sources of revenue, and 8% of you say that you have over 10 sources of revenue. So that's interesting information. After this is over, I'm going to stop and take a look and see how that correlates to your income level, your revenue, not your personal income, obviously, your organizational income level. And we'll see if over time and as you do your assessments, if we were to run this poll again, we would see if those numbers would start creeping up a little bit. So in a funding audit, again, you may choose to do this for a single year, but you may choose to do it for more than 1 year in order to zero in on any changes and trends that are of significance. And be careful that one incident does not make a trend. You would list sources of revenue by dollar amount, sources of revenue by percentage. You would look at, as we discussed before, restricted and unrestricted funding, which is short-term, which is long-term. How predictable is your funding? We know that government policy changes and the economy changes and the government changes, but more or less sometimes we have an indication of what's predictable and what's not predictable. And then along with that, what's your level of autonomy? How tied are you to the specific demands of the funder and how you can spend the dollars? or how much freedom or leeway do you have with the funding. It's also important to look at milestones in terms of end dates and renegotiation dates, so that you have a sense of how much of your funding is ending at the same time. An example about predictability and autonomy is that, for example, some foundation grants may have low predictability and low autonomy, whereas endowments, so money that you get, for example, through the will of someone who has then passed away, that income is predictable. You know that that's going to happen at some point, and depending on your arrangement, you can have high autonomy if that endowment fund is not restricted. So if it's an unrestricted endowment fund, then you have more autonomy. Pie charts are a useful way to visualize and communicate different sources of income. I know that some of you use these in your reports, for example. In this one, we see the federal government is a large funder, we see the province, etc., and miscellaneous is 0, as in less than 1%. After the core part of this presentation is over, I will be going into more detail about the funding audit for those of you who are interested. So once we know all of this, we can look at determining the right funding mix for your organization. Woods Bowman has written some articles for the Nonprofit Quarterly Journal, and he says all dollars flowing into nonprofits are not equal. Every revenue source has specific characteristics. He refers to portfolio and normative theory. So let's think about first how we invest any personal savings that we may have. We can diversify our investments to reduce how vulnerable we are to recession or to a downward turn in the markets. We can also choose a select few investments that are suited to our comfort level and needs. Mr. Bowman's definitions of portfolio applies to securing different types of funding and comes with the warning that we've already discussed: each spring will work. Normative theory is about focusing in on funding that's expressly for settlement, for example. So Petra's going to launch another poll, and then we won't have too many more after this, about whether you and your board discuss your funding mix. So the question is, at our board meetings, we discuss our funding mix and how it might change. Again, don't know is an option. Okay, so about half of you have let us know. So we'll be looking shortly at ways to support your board members as they address sustainability issues. So far we have 45% saying yes, we do discuss this at the board. 29% say don't know, 14% say no, and around 10% say not yet, but we will. So that's encouraging that we can hopefully say by the end of the next couple of board meetings that well over half of you will be discussing funding mix at the board level. And for those of you that say no, I strongly encourage you to consider it, because it's very valuable. As a board member myself, I know it's extremely valuable to know what our funding mix and how it's changing and improving over time. In your funding audit, you may want to include a column for comments about supporting each funding source that will allow you to capture elements such as how much time it takes you each month, quarter, or year to compile the reports required by your funders. And there are many questions you can ask yourself about the return on investment of your time and energy in preparing proposals. Now I know we're going into a big, and some of you are already in a big time of preparing proposals. I understand that it's a lot of work. The next few slides we share with permission from the Canadian Community Economic Development Network, There's some slides from a webinar that a colleague attended, and we think it's a very useful and graphic example about building capacity for your sustainability. Now in the slide you will see a line that says G&A. These are indirect overhead costs that are considered to be general and administrative. There we go. So let's look at how the private sector calculates the price of a product. So here's our cup of coffee to go. You can see the amount that the coffee itself costs, the dairy, the outside. You can see how much of this is labor, how much is allocated to rent, to marketing, and other administrative expenses. The profit is right in there. So when you pay, in this instance, $2.49 for a cup of coffee, 30% of that cup of coffee is profit. So the more cups of coffee you sell, the more money you make because the costs remain the same. Now here's what many nonprofits do. We can see that the operating profit is $0, that the service cost is $2.49, and the customer fee is $2. So we calculate out costs for delivering a certain service by ignoring or underestimating those general administrative expenses, so that instead of 50 cents we have 31 cents. And we assume we're not allowed to make a profit or have a surplus, so we don't factor that in. So what happens over time is that with every project we add, we lose more money. And with one project we get in the hole a little bit. The more projects we add, the bigger the hole. So the consequence is organizations have to fundraise just to keep projects running and to keep their doors open. But we want to get to a point of keeping a surplus at the end of the year. So again, we won't be able to go into this any further now because then we would be looking at financial management, but we did want to share this example with you because cups of coffee are very common and easy to relate to. So in the fundraising audit then, where are we now? Where do we want to be and how will we get there? So some of you or your board-led fundraising committees may be interested in doing this exercise called the fundraising audit. It begins with a thorough understanding of your current position, a detailed review of any factors that are likely to have a negative impact on your organization's ability to raise funds. It feeds into the issue of partnerships as it involves looking at potential collaborators. And again, that will be in the third webinar of this series. That's as much as we are going to do on that right now so that we can move on to the environmental scan for settlement organizations. A generally accepted definition of settlement used by the sector, it's a bit wordy, is a long-term, dynamic, two-way process through which ideally immigrants would achieve full equality and freedom of participation in society, and society would gain access to the full human resource potential in its immigrant communities. I don't have the answers to these questions, but I'm going to pose them to you anyway to encourage you to look at settlement in different ways. Can you think of another way to define settlement? How would you break it down into its component parts? Is there another role settlement agencies could play as they grow with their populations? The answers may open your eyes to new approaches to different funding sources that you may be able to tap into. For example, some community health-based groups have been able to argue successfully that settlement is a health issue. Who's doing health-based work in your community or with your clients? Where do you overlap? What could you do together? Where are the opportunities for partnerships? This is a big question for another day, but learning about alternate sources of funding can actually be kind of fun because you can get out there and talk to all kinds of people. Talk to your peers, find out if they're tapping into new or different sources of funding. Find out if you could work together or if you could start up something similar in your part of the province. Use internet-based groups such as Nonprofit Professionals Group on LinkedIn. There was just the other day some back and forth about alternate sources of funding and some suggestions. Do web-based research on donors and their priorities. Consult directories such as Big Online. You may need to engage the help of a fundraiser, and you may also have many other ideas. Now, a request came up to email the definition for settlement, so certainly we won't do that right now, but I have marked that as something to do afterwards. Thank you. Time to talk about some important people in your organization, your staff and your board, and how this relates to funding diversification. So, you say the whole organization needs to be innovative. Where does this innovation come from? In order to be sustainable, yes, the whole organization needs to be innovative and engaged. Good ideas can come from anywhere. If this doesn't currently describe the culture of your organization, there are certain points you may consider. Staff engagement is a human resources management question that we cannot begin to answer fully here today. However, we'd like to make the link between funding diversification and an engaged staff that is given the opportunity to contribute innovative, cost-saving, or revenue-generating ideas. Leadership and management styles are critical. The organization that allows for reflection, listens, and rewards innovation may well end up with a more creative income diversification plan and more buy-in at all levels of the organization. Petra's going to launch our last poll now, and it's about how you bring information and ideas to your organization, regardless of what position you have. The choices that you have are through your previous work experience, volunteer experience with other organizations, conversations with people you meet, news you've heard on the radio or read in the paper, and your own insights. Now, there may be more ideas, but we don't have space for them, so we'll ask you to choose from these and give you a moment to do that. So half of you have let us know. We've got quite an interesting split. Okay, so we see that 36% of you say that your ideas and insights come from your previous work experience. 26% of you, conversations with the people that you meet. That's great. Someday I would love to find out if that's your next door neighbor or if it's a colleague in another organization. 17% your own insights as well as news that you have heard or read. But we have a 0% from volunteer experience with other nonprofits. If we were in person, I would be asking how many of you actually do volunteer with their organizations and hold that role. So that's great. Thank you very much. Let's spend a moment to think about your board members. Ideally, your board members will be very knowledgeable about your organization. Each and every one should have an in-depth understanding of the business model of the organization. How are you structured? What is your mix of programs and fundraising activities, and how do they work together to achieve impacts and financial results? What is the current and desired resource mix? You can use the matrix map to communicate this information to your board. In addition, board members should be able to read and analyze your financial statements and know what questions to ask. Consider suggesting to your board members to listen to the Advanced Financial Management webinar and that they attend any other opportunities for financial management training for nonprofits. At the very least, you may choose to offer an annual refresher on reading and interpreting your organization's monthly financial statements. Board members should be actively engaged in the organization, and how you do this will vary according to your organizational culture and the board members you've recruited. It may mean that you have active committees, you share program results regularly, that you celebrate successes, that you run effective meetings that make the most of your volunteers' time and expertise. Financial oversight and accountability are key responsibilities of board members. And I don't want to underemphasize their importance, but, and you knew there would be a but, consider helping them shift their thinking to how they can contribute to the ongoing financial sustainability of your organization. To look at how to generate resources, not only at whether those resources are spent wisely and honestly. Your organization could consider having a committee called Finance and Sustainability, composed of finance and program types, which could also address broader sustainability issues. So speaking of resources, here are some for you. I won't go through all of them. You have the slides, but I'll say that there are several. There we go. So what are our key messages from today? Income diversification is one aspect of sustainability planning. Look at your organization and its funding from different perspectives and empower staff and board to contribute their ideas and expertise. Analyze sources of revenue and assess the impact that you're making with these funds. Do a risk assessment and document the costs of securing these funds. While I sometimes don't get much solace from this one, if you fail to plan, you plan to fail, it does really ring true for a lot of people personally and organizationally. Empower staff and board to contribute their ideas and expertise about income diversification and sustainability and include their input in a plan that's right for your organization. I do have a few more slides to go before we've come to the end of our core part of our presentation, and then I will open it up to questions, and I'll continue with a more detailed look at a funding audit for an organization. So homework, conduct a funding audit. I'm just going to switch over to that homework assignment, so to speak. So I hope I do this properly. Hold on. Okay, I'm having a little trouble with that, so not to worry, but you will see in the homework that you were emailed in advance a detailed description of how to do the funding audit. Okay, great. So upcoming webinars, here's my backup helping because I'm having trouble with that, but I'll finish this bit first, then we'll go back to the homework assignment. Webinars, we have the 23rd of August, Collaborations, Partnerships, and Mergers, September 6th, Introduction to Social Enterprise, the 19th, Social Enterprise, Feasibility, and October the 4th, Social Enterprise Planning. Okay, so I'm going to try again with the homework assignment. Hold on a minute. That's what didn't work. All right, someone else got the magic touch. One second, we'll just get that up here. There it is. Don't go away. Okay, so we have who to complete this exercise. You may be the only person who can do this audit. On the other hand, you may need some assistance with it. And here are the questions. These are the steps. There are several. Don't be intimidated. They're all extremely valuable. So if you have an opportunity to do that in the next while or two, at least get it started, that would be a good thing, because in a week's time, there will be an online question and answer for an hour through the community of practice, and I can help answer some questions you may have. Okay. Oh, okay, a message has been sent about that. Great. So we're going to come away from this, and we're now at the end of the main part of today's presentation. Do you have any additional questions that you would like to ask now? I'll look over at Petra for her support. And I'll read the question out to you. Those of you who do have to leave before we finish this, please remember to fill out your evaluation that will pop up when you log off. You mentioned that sustainability and diversification is best done when an organization focuses on its mission. Question: does an organization have to unpack its mission in order to find the potential for diversification? Meaning, does an organization need to deeply understand its mission? Wow, super. So we have a three-part question. I'll start with the last part. So yes, an organization needs to deeply understand its mission so that it knows it's on the right track and doing the right thing. So this may mean, if you feel that that's not the case, it may be time to plan for getting together with your board, getting together with your staff and your senior staff to look at, well, what is it? Stop and do an assessment. Are we doing this just because? Are we doing this for a good reason? So go through the whole, if you feel it's not valid, you have to go back a few steps and start over with your whole strategic planning. In terms of unpacking your mission in order to find the potential for diversification, I think you would leave your mission alone and then go deeper through looking at what are your strategic priorities, what are your strategic directions, what are the tasks that you need to take in order to complete your strategic directions, and then how much and where you're going to get money from for those tasks. So it's a little bit like the house that Jack built. So yes, you unpack it, but not the actual mission, I would say. So thank you for that question. We'll see if there's another one. I think that was it for now, right? Okay. So again, I would say you're welcome to stay on a little longer. If you are leaving us now, I'd like to say that I hope you go away with at least one aha moment that has caused you to look at sustainability in a different way, and with at least one piece of information to share with your staff and board members. So I'm going to carry on then. The following slides are about a fictitious organization, so rather than use the financial statements of an organization, I've put this together for us so that we can take a look in more detail at what you can include in your funding audit. So here we have revenue, sources of revenue by dollar amount. You'll see an asterisk beside foundation in year 2. That's comprised of 3 different foundation grants. You can see there's a big increase. So what does this show us? This table shows sources of revenue for our organization for 2 years. It identifies the sources of revenue and the dollar amounts so that we can look at percentage of funding from any one specific funder in relation to the whole budget. This organization took a close look at its funding in year one and decided to make a concerted effort to increase the amount of revenue from foundations. It sent out several applications and received 2 new grants, one for 1 year and one for 2 years. It has an annual popular fundraising event that brings in roughly the same amount of money each year. We can see the overall revenue has increased by $38,000. Overall, there's a 6.6% increase in funding despite a 10% decrease in the federal grant. This table shows us the percent of revenue by source. We can see that going from year 1 to year 2, the organization is still highly dependent on government funding, but there's been a shift in the percentages. So we've gone from 70% to 59%. Go down to donations. Note that while the percentage remains the same for donations, at a low 1%, the dollar amount for donations has actually doubled from $3,000 to $6,000. That was our last slide. It will be important, this should twig something for you, and it will be important to take a closer look at the donations line. Is the increase due to a single donation of $3,000? Have the same number of people given more money? Has the number of donors increased? By how much? And so on. And how much did it cost you to elicit and process the additional donations? So at first glance, 1%, 1%, you don't think there's anything to think about. But if you take a closer look, there could in fact be some very valuable information there for you. So back to our pie chart. This is the one we used in the previous part of the presentation. It visually highlights the reliance on government funding. You can make a chart of where you are, and you can make a chart of where you'd like to be. Some people find it very motivational to have a photo of their dream home or a percentage income chart up in their desk and they can take a look. Year 2 looks very similar but not the same. The blue for the federal government section has decreased and the purple for foundations has increased. This chart is very easy to prepare. It's a bar chart that tells us changes in percentage of revenue. Blue is year 1, red is year 2. So the percentage of 1-year income, meaning income that is guaranteed for 1 year, has increased from 16% to 22%. So this money could be 1-year grants and money raised through events and donations. The amount of funding in its last year or final year, that should probably say, has dropped from 10.5% to 4%, so not as dramatic a change. The amount of funding in midstream, so that's the big red bar there, has increased dramatically because of the movement of the largest grant. So this largest grant, as we will see it in a little bit, is a 3-year grant and it's moving through the system. So it's gone from 4% to 69%. This tells us that our organization has another year to plan to identify whether or not this is an activity that it wants to sustain, to get a sense of government policy and funding trends, and to make plans for how to fill a gap in funding if the amount of funding from the major funder decreases again. We've seen that it's gone down 10% from 1 year to the next. It may do so in the future. And we have a corresponding big drop in the amount of funding that's in the first year of its life cycle just because of the progression of that major grant. Is this money restricted or unrestricted? We talked about this in the first webinar and mentioned it very briefly today. In this case, we see a very small shift towards more unrestricted funds, but it's a shift nevertheless. Remember the context. We've had a 10% decrease in federal funding and an increase of funding from one foundation to 3 foundations. Some experts immediately say we should reduce the amount of restricted funding our organization relies on. Other experts recommend rethinking restricted funding and state that it's okay as long as the restricted funding covers your core work. What we don't want is to be pulled into unaligned directions, so that is, directions that take us away from our mission, or to not be funded adequately for the outcomes that we are expected to deliver. The final one, I had a very pretty bar chart for you that just didn't translate very well, so this one isn't perhaps quite as helpful, so let's go through it. These are the timelines for our sources of income. So we see our federal funding. We've got year 1 in 2012, year 2, final year in 2014. Our provincial funding, we have a 2-year cycle in this example. So we have one cycle ending in 2012 and another one in 2014. The municipal funding in this example is an annual grant, so it's final every year. Foundation funding, there can be a mix, so it's important to break it down by individual source. You would do the same if you had several federal grants, several provincial grants, etc. This chart would be considerably longer. So we have one foundation grant that was a 3-year grant ending in 2013. We have a 1-year grant, and we have a 2-year grant. So you can see the split there. So what do we do with this information? Take a look, and you would know for yourselves if you worked here what the potential for renewal was. Look at how you may need to bridge certain grants and how staffing and resources will be impacted by the end of any particular grant or set of grants. So for this organization, 2014 is a big year because we see that most of its money is scheduled to end in 2014. We know that this is not necessarily cause for alarm because our sector has lived with this kind of uncertainty for a long time. But what can we do with this information? You may want to build up unrestricted funds to enable more flexibility. You may want to look at options for bridging funding. So if you don't get a grant for 1 year for your program that's one of your hearts in your matrix map, is there another source of funding or another way to keep that program going until you get the funding back again? I've seen this done successfully by an organization, a group of organizations that were running a program together. The funding ended. They had to let go of their staff person, but they were determined they were not going to let go of that program. So what they did instead was to reallocate, scale down a little bit, reallocate the main job duties of that one staff person on a rotating basis among the organizations, and keep it going, write a successful grant proposal, and then in fact double their staff to 2 and continue to progress. So it takes a lot of coordination, but that's the kind of thing that you may have done already or you may see your colleagues do. Event money, donations, etc. I didn't put on here. They appear to be constant over time. There is no guarantee. It's important to take a closer look. Do you have any questions at this point? No? Well, we'll hope that's a good thing. Do you have any comments at this point that you would like to type in? We'll give you a moment and then move on to a couple more things. Nope. Okay, getting close to lunch. I cannot make 1 second. Okay, so what you have up on the screen right now is the website of Imagine Canada. You may be familiar with it. It has a very valuable section on it called the Nonprofit Library. I have, in my work and in my volunteer work, I've come here and consulted this website different times. In the last webinar, you asked for Canadian examples and Canadian resources, so this, I think, is a very valuable one for you to take a look at. And it's free of charge. So I'll just go down here. You can see they have resource guides and they also have research. So if we look at, now of course we don't have sustainability as an option here, but some of what we touched on today has to do with board governance. So we'll just continue down this line for a moment. And you can see there's essential reading on board governance, all kinds about recruiting and maintaining board members. There's a workbook on financial responsibilities of nonprofit boards, etc. So this is a very useful resource. Now I'm going to go back up and see if I can successfully search something. Let's see. Boards governance. We'll go back one more. So there's truly a lot of valuable information here. It's easy to get lost a little bit. Okay, I'm not finding what I'm looking for at the moment. So that's one valuable resource, and you have that listed in your resources slides. Another one is the Canadian CED network. So we credited them with the slides about the coffee cup example. Okay, yeah, I'll come to that. Okay, so the Canadian CED network, valuable reports. It's useful to be in touch with what's going on in terms of sustainability, etc., so that you can include references to research and reports in what you do. So all policy documents, etc., on the Canadian CED network. Another useful website is the Fundraising Audit, and this is where we got some of the information that we used in our webinar today. It outlines the stages of a fundraising plan, and it provides guidance on all the different things that you can consider. So if we click on here, they look at, as with strategic planning, what's going on in the environment outside the organization, politically, economically, technologically. We'll come down a little bit. They also give some resources. The resources that they give here are either from the UK or the US. Excuse me. They look at an analysis of competitors. While we know that collaboration is very strong in the nonprofit sector, we also know that we are applying in many instances for the same pot of funds. So it talks about looking at other nonprofits serving the same cause, other nonprofits of similar size, etc. And you may also look at geographic region. Talks about potential collaborators, market factors, what's going on in the donor world, what's going on, and it gives some resources. In Canada, we have a chapter of the Association of Fundraising Professionals, for example. You have Imagine Canada that we just looked at. Looking at the internal environment. So it's sounding a lot like strategic planning, isn't it? Strengths, weaknesses, opportunities, and threats down there, etc. So these are just a few resources that we have online that we think might be useful to you. Now there are, one second, I'm just going to check because I believe that despite my best intentions, I did leave off some resources from the list. So I will ask that you be sent a list of resources that are available on the orgwise.ca website that you would find related to this webinar series. So my apologies, I had that information and it just didn't quite make it into a slide. So again, that will be sent out and we'll be sure to include those resources in the next series. So unless there are any final questions, we will finish up a couple of minutes early, so I'll give you a moment. Nope, super. Well, thank you again very, very much for attending today's webinar. Please do, if you have not already signed on to orgwise.ca, please do so, and please complete the evaluation. Thank you so much, and have a wonderful day.